If you've ever lost any game ever, you know how frustrating some games can be. When you feel like a loss isn't your fault but a result of luck, when a dice roll or a random number generator screws you over, it just feels bad. People think that winning or losing is best when it's a result of skill, because it feels good to succeed fairly, or even if you lose, to be able to learn from your mistakes. Thus, it seems obvious that making games less random and more fair is a good thing. But it's a lot more complicated than that. Randomness provides something invaluable to games: accessibility. A lot of board games and casual games have many players of different skill levels. Love it or hate it, luck can correct for this and balance things out. Even if I'm the better player in Monopoly or Scrabble, I won't win every game I play. Furthermore, party games like Mario Kart and Mario Party couldn't exist without luck. The silly casual atmosphere of these games wouldn't jive with gameplay about using pure, cold calculation to destroy your opponent. So, if luck is here to stay, how do we use it without making games feel frustrating and unfair? Before we dive into this though, it will be useful to understand on a deeper level the problem that randomness exists to solve in games, and we can see that by looking to chess. For the 5 of you that don't know, chess is one of the oldest and most competitive games that is still played today. I won't pretend that chess is a flawed game, but if every game were like chess, we would lose a lot. For one, at high levels of play, and even for intermediate players, there can be a lot of memorization of openings, or how to play the first 10 or 20 moves. Furthermore, chess isn't always a good game to play with friends. If there's a significant difference in skill between two players, the better player will win 90+% of the games, which is frustrating for the player who keeps losing. And for some of the best players, it's normal for lots of games to end in a draw, which isn't always exciting. Now, before all of you chess fans swap me, I want to emphasize that I like chess, and we'll talk later about how some of these things aren't always bad for games, and how we can solve some of these problems without using randomness. The only reason I brought up chess is to explain that randomness can be a way to commit bird genocide with only one stone. Randomness can help games be less frustrating and biased towards the better player, and game designers can use different amounts of it based on how much they want to even things out. Randomness prevents players from memorizing things like openings, because you fundamentally can't control or predict randomness. It can also make games more exciting, and prevent draws from happening. Finally, testing a player's risk management and understanding of probability is a perfectly reasonable skill to test. So even though luck can be frustrating, it's not a fundamentally bad thing. Before we try to figure out the best ways to use randomness in games, we first need to understand what it is that can make randomness so frustrating. Although there are multiple reasons, the most obvious is the unpredictability of it. To be punished for something out of your control isn't fun. So, we shouldn't be surprised if one of the simplest ways to make randomness less frustrating is to make it more predictable. For example, when you attack another territory in Risk, you can never be certain that you'll win, even if you heavily outnumber your opponent. If you get unlucky, one bad loss can cost you the entire game. In the Steam version of Risk, however, there's an option to use Balanced Blitz, which removes the statistical outliers and prevents people from getting extremely lucky or unlucky. It also tells you the probability of victory, so that you can make informed decisions. While some purists prefer the true randomness of the die, I think Balanced Blitz helps make the game more forgiving, and is a perfect example of a way to make luck less annoying. In a similar way, Nintendo designed Mario Kart's item boxes with a lot of intelligence. Instead of just giving a player an item completely randomly, the item boxes heavily favor the races near the back of the pack. This ensures that everyone has a chance to win up until someone crosses the finish line. As stated earlier, it's very common for randomness to be used to make games more accessible and enjoyable for people of different skill levels. But without any checks in place, it's also possible that the best player gets really lucky, giving them even more of an unfair advantage. So, to bias the luck in favor of the losing players is a smart strategy. Another thing to consider carefully is how much of an investment a player makes in a game, and how luck affects that. If you've ever lost a quick 6-hour game of Monopoly, you know what it feels like to want to murder another human being. You also know how unfair Monopoly can feel. One of the reasons for this is that there is such a huge time investment into a Monopoly game, and maybe lots of strategizing as well. So if one bad dice roll screws you over, or worse, lots of mildly unlucky things drain your finances over an 8-hour game, it feels terrible. The problem isn't necessarily the existence of randomness, but the fact that hours of time and strategy aren't always rewarded. Actually, if we look at Mario Kart again, we can see another thing that makes it great here. Not only are the races short and sweet, but there's also multiple of them in a cup. This means that even if bad luck hurts you, the investment of time and effort you put into each game is small. You might have one bad race that's not your fault, but that's a lot less frustrating in a casual environment where you have multiple chances to win. So far, we've talked a lot about board games and party games because they use a lot of randomness. They are supposed to be exciting, where anyone of any skill level can win. If we think of games as existing on a spectrum, maybe with the exception of Risk, these would be the accessible or luck-based games. Whereas a lot of old games like chess and Go, as well as many competitive esports games, would be on the fair or skill-based side. This is important, because most of what I've laid out are ways of making games feel a little more fair, and less likely to incite violence than Monopoly. I'm bringing this up because at the beginning of the video, I said that the solution for games isn't to get rid of randomness, but to use it differently. But for a lot of serious competitive games, that's not true. Unlike Mario Party, some games really are trying to find the best player. Interestingly enough, this means some of the games on this end of the spectrum have the opposite problem from what we've been talking about. They are frustrating not because of unfairness or luck, but because they feel inaccessible and difficult. So how do these games solve some of the problems caused by an inability to use randomness? One thing to consider is that games with walls of texts and rules, or complicated inputs to memorize, can be frustrating to learn. It may sound obvious, and it won't fix all of our problems, but striving for something easy to learn and hard to master is a reasonable goal, and there are many ways to go about it. One thing I like about Super Smash Bros. Is that there are only 4 main types of attack on the ground, with different versions of each depending on the direction you attack in. Learning the basics and even trying out different fighters is easy early on. Even in a fighter game like Injustice 2, which does have more input combinations to memorize, early on there are other things you can do to improve your skills without having to worry about it right away. Getting better at competitive games is also made easier just by how those games work. If you're playing ranked games online, you're mostly going to play against people at your level. You don't need some godlike understanding of the game when you load up your first match. Earlier, I talked about how chess can be tough to learn and that there's a lot of opening and endgame theory to memorize. But this isn't necessarily a terrible thing. At first, it's much more important to understand basic principles and tactics, and you learn the rest not all at once, but over the course of your journey to improve. Something I haven't mentioned yet is randomness's ability to force adaptive play. When a player has to respond to an event that they couldn't have foreseen, it forces them to be quick on their feet. Many games that rely on cards make you change up your plans repeatedly, and as often as someone plays a card you didn't know they had. To try to challenge the skill in a board game without using randomness could be difficult, but thankfully video games make this a lot easier. Lack of information, mixed with the unpredictability of player action, can substitute randomness and challenge adaptive play. This isn't randomness in the sense that there's a random number generator that decides how the game plays out, but from the player's perspective, certain things are unpredictable in the same way that random events are. For example, in a shooter game, quick decision-making and the ability to adapt to situations is challenged if you run into an enemy player that you didn't expect. The real-time nature of the game, as well as the fact that it's impossible to know where all the players are or what gear they have, force the player to be prepared for anything. It's also important to realize that a little bit of frustration is okay, and maybe even desirable. If you look at a game like Dark Souls, it's clear that anger can be part of a game's experience. The little bit of frustration and anger can be fueled into trying to get better, and it also makes it that much more satisfying when you get past the obstacle that was preventing you from moving forward. Now obviously, Dark Souls isn't a competitive game, but if we look at competitive games, I think we see something similar. As annoying as it is to lose to someone and realize that there's no one to blame but yourself, it's also nice to know that all of the tools to get better are in your hands. Whether it's chess, Smash, Valorant, Go, or God forbid you play League of Legends, having a game you can just get good at is really nice. Unless you're better than me, because then you really should stop grinding. Games are complicated. A lot of things in game design can't always be labeled as good or bad. It's true that randomness can suck, but it's also a really important tool that can't always be gotten rid of. For some games, it's best to just work around the problem and do your best to make the game feel fair and balanced. As we move on to more serious competitive games, however, it's really important that luck plays little to no role in who wins. This can create its own problems, but with clever game design, they can be dealt with. My science teacher used to say that there are no solutions, only trade-offs, and I think that really applies here. Injecting chaos into a game has pros and cons. Whether you like chess, or Candyland, or something in between, there are a lot of unique ways to use randomness or its absence to make really good games. And as long as we're not playing Monopoly, we can all have fun. This has been Preserved Moment. Tell me if I said anything dumb in the comments, and thanks for watching.